The dust kicked up in swirling clouds as Grace Robinson stepped between the young boy and the three men who had cornered him in the narrow alley beside the general store, her green eyes blazing with a fury that made even the largest of the men hesitate for just a moment. It was the summer of 1883 in Tascosa, Texas, and the heat bore down mercilessly on the rutted streets of the panhandle town. Grace had arrived only 2 weeks prior, hired as a schoolteacher for the fall term that would begin in September. She had been inspecting the schoolhouse and purchasing supplies when she heard the child crying out for help. Without thinking, she had rushed toward the sound, her practical boots pounding against the wooden planks of the boardwalk. The boy could not have been more than 8 years old, his clothes ragged and his face streaked with tears and dirt. The men surrounding him were ranch hands, their breath reeking of whiskey even at 2 in the afternoon. The tallest one held a worn leather satchel that clearly belonged to the child. "Give him back his belongings," Grace demanded, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. She was 22 years old and had grown up in Boston, but her father had been a minister who believed in standing up for those who could not defend themselves. That lesson had been carved into her very bones. "This ain't none of your concern, lady," the tall one said, his words slurring slightly. "Boy stole from us." "That is a lie," the child whimpered from behind Grace's skirts. "I never stole nothing. That is my ma's medicine bag. She sent me to fetch her tonic from Doc Henderson." Grace studied the men with a sharp gaze. She could see the meanness in their eyes, the kind that came from too much drink and too little conscience. "I said give it back. Now." The second man, stocky with a thick mustache, laughed. "Or what? You gonna make us?" Grace's hand moved to her reticule, where she kept a small derringer her father had given her before she left Boston. She did not draw it, but the gesture was clear enough. "I will make a scene loud enough to bring the sheriff running, and then we will all discuss this situation in his office. Something tells me you gentlemen would prefer to avoid that conversation." It was at that exact moment that Kade Zimmerman rounded the corner on his bay mare, having just finished delivering a string of horses to the livery stable. He was 25 years old, tall and lean with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. His blue eyes took in the scene with the quick assessment of a man who had spent his life reading dangerous situations. He swung down from his horse in one fluid motion. "There a problem here." His voice was calm but carried an edge of steel. The three men turned, and their aggressive postures immediately shifted. Everyone in Tascosa knew Kade Zimmerman. He was a horse breeder and trainer, but before that, he had spent 2 years as a deputy marshal in Kansas. He was known to be fair but absolutely uncompromising when it came to protecting the innocent. "No problem," the tall one muttered. He tossed the satchel toward the boy, who caught it with trembling hands. "We was just having a misunderstanding." "Then I suggest you clear it up by moving along," Kade said quietly. His hand rested casually on his hip, not quite touching his gun but close enough to send a message. The three men shuffled past, casting resentful glances back at Grace and the boy. When they had disappeared around the corner, Kade turned his full attention to the woman standing protectively in front of the child. The late afternoon sun caught her auburn hair, which she wore pinned up in a practical style that nonetheless showed off the elegant line of her neck. Her dress was simple calico, but she wore it with a natural grace that spoke of good breeding. What struck him most, however, was the fierce determination still burning in her eyes. "You have the heart I have been seeking," he said quietly, almost as if the words surprised him as much as they might surprise her. He had spent years looking for someone who possessed true courage, the kind that came from genuine compassion rather than recklessness. His own mother had possessed such a heart before she died when he was 15. His father had always said that finding a woman with that rare combination of strength and kindness was worth more than all the gold in California. Grace blinked, her cheeks coloring slightly at the intensity in his gaze. "I beg your pardon." Kade removed his hat, revealing the full impact of his rugged features. "I apologize for being forward, miss. I am Kade Zimmerman. I just meant that what you did there, stepping in to defend this boy, that took real courage." The child tugged at Grace's skirt. "Miss, I need to get this medicine home to Ma. She has been feeling poorly all week." Grace knelt down, her expression softening. "Of course, sweetheart. Where do you live? Would you like me to walk with you? We live out past the old mission, but I can make it on my own now." "Thank you kindly for helping me, miss." The boy clutched his satchel to his chest and scurried off before Grace could protest. She rose to her feet, brushing dust from her skirts, suddenly very aware that she was alone with this striking cowboy who was looking at her as though she had done something remarkable rather than simply decent. "I am Grace Robinson. I will be teaching at the school this fall." "A teacher," Kade said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "That suits you." "You do not know me at all, Mr. Zimmerman. How can you possibly know what suits me?" Despite her words, there was no real sharpness in her tone, just curiosity. "I know you put yourself between a frightened child and 3 drunk men without hesitation. I know you stood your ground even though you were outnumbered. And I know you care more about doing what is right than what is safe." He held her gaze steadily. "That tells me plenty." Grace found herself unable to look away from those blue eyes. There was something deeply honest in them, a directness she found both unnerving and appealing. In Boston, men had danced around their intentions with elaborate social rituals. This man simply said what he meant. "I should return to my boarding house," she said, though she made no immediate move to leave. "Mrs. Patterson will be expecting me for supper." "May I walk you there?" Kade gestured to his horse. "And before you refuse on account of propriety, I will lead Ranger here and walk beside you at a perfectly respectable distance. Tascosa is growing, but it still has rough elements, as you just witnessed." Grace hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Very well, thank you." They began walking down the main street, Kade leading his mare and keeping his word about maintaining a proper distance. The town bustled around them with the activity of late afternoon. Cowboys rode in from the surrounding ranches, shopkeepers swept their storefronts, and women in sunbonnets hurried to complete their errands before supper time. "Have you been in Tascosa long?" Grace asked, curious about this man who had appeared at exactly the right moment. "I was born not far from here, actually. My father started a horse ranch about 10 miles north of town when I was just a baby. After my mother passed and my father got too old to manage the place alone, I took it over. That was 3 years ago now." "I am sorry about your mother," Grace said softly. "Thank you. It has been 10 years, but I still miss her every day." He glanced at Grace. "She would have liked you. She was always defending strays and underdogs herself. Drove my father half mad with worry sometimes." "And what about you? Does defending people drive you mad with worry?" A corner of his mouth lifted. "Only when they are taking on 3 men in an alley without backup." Grace laughed despite herself. "I suppose that was rather reckless, but I could not simply walk past. That child was terrified." "Which brings me back to what I said earlier. You have exactly the kind of heart I have been looking for." Kade paused, then continued carefully. "I hope this does not offend you, Miss Robinson, but I would very much like to call on you properly. With Mrs. Patterson as chaperone, of course." Grace felt her pulse quicken. She barely knew this man, and yet there was something about him that called to something deep within her. Perhaps it was the way he had stepped in to help without hesitation, mirroring her own instinct to protect the vulnerable. Perhaps it was the quiet strength he carried, or the way he looked at her as though she was someone worth knowing rather than simply a pretty face. "I think I would like that, Mr. Zimmerman," she said. "Kade, please. Then you must call me Grace." They reached Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, a tidy two-story structure painted white with green shutters. The widow who ran it was known for being particular about her tenants and strict about propriety, which was precisely why Grace's father had approved of the arrangement. "I will come by tomorrow evening around 7, if that suits you," Kade said. "That would be perfect." He tipped his hat to her, and Grace found herself watching as he swung up into his saddle with easy grace and rode back toward the center of town. Her heart was doing strange things in her chest, and she could not quite wipe the smile from her face as she climbed the steps to the front door. Mrs. Patterson appeared in the doorway before Grace could even reach for the handle. She was a robust woman in her 50s with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Who was that man walking you home?" "His name is Kade Zimmerman. He helped me with a difficult situation in town, and he offered to escort me back safely." "Zimmerman," Mrs. Patterson repeated, her expression softening. "Good family. His father, Henry Zimmerman, is an honest man, and his son has the same reputation. Lost his mother young, which gave him more responsibility than most boys his age. Steadied him, I think." She studied Grace with a knowing look. "He asked to call on you, did he not?" Grace felt her cheeks warm. "Yes, madam, tomorrow evening." "Well, that is perfectly acceptable. I will ensure we have a proper parlor visit. Come in now and wash up. Supper is nearly ready." That night, Grace lay in her small but comfortable room and thought about the unexpected turn her day had taken. She had come to Texas seeking adventure and independence, wanting to prove herself capable of managing on her own after years of her father's overprotective hovering. Her mother had died giving birth to a stillborn son when Grace was 10, leaving her father to raise her alone. He had poured all his fear and love into keeping her safe, until Grace felt she might suffocate from his well-meaning restrictions. Teaching in Tascosa had seemed like the perfect opportunity to build her own life while still doing work that mattered. She had not expected to meet anyone who would interest her romantically, certainly not within her first 2 weeks in town. But there was something about Kade Zimmerman that had struck a chord deep within her. The way he had looked at her when he said she had the heart he had been seeking, as though he truly saw her, not just the proper exterior she presented to the world. The next day passed with agonizing slowness. Grace spent the morning organizing her teaching materials, and the afternoon helping Mrs. Patterson with household tasks. By the time 7 o'clock approached, she had changed her dress 3 times and fussed with her hair until Mrs. Patterson finally shooed her downstairs. "Sit down before you wear a hole in the carpet, child. He will be here soon enough." At precisely 7, a knock sounded at the door. Mrs. Patterson answered it and showed Kade into the parlor, where Grace waited with her hands folded in her lap to keep them from trembling. Kade had clearly taken care with his appearance. His dark hair was neatly combed, his face freshly shaved, and he wore clean trousers and a pressed shirt. He carried a small bouquet of wildflowers that he presented to Grace with a smile that made her stomach flutter. "I picked these this afternoon. They grow all over the property. My mother used to love them." "They are beautiful," Grace said, accepting them with genuine pleasure. Wildflowers suited her much better than the hothouse roses men in Boston had sent. Mrs. Patterson settled herself in a chair near the window with her knitting, providing the required chaperone presence while making it clear she would not interfere unless necessary. Kade sat across from Grace in the modest parlor, his hat resting on his knee. "I hope your day was pleasant," he began. "It was productive. I have been preparing lesson plans for the fall term. What about you?" I had a mare foal this morning, a beautiful filly with perfect conformation. She is going to be something special." His enthusiasm was evident, and it made Grace smile. "Tell me about your horses, Mrs. Patterson mentioned your father started the ranch." Cade's face lit up as he spoke about the breeding program his father had begun and that he had expanded. He explained how he selected breeding pairs to improve temperament and endurance, creating horses that could handle the demanding conditions of ranch work while remaining responsive and intelligent. Grace found herself leaning forward, genuinely fascinated not just by the subject matter but by the passion and intelligence with which Cade discussed it. "I apologize," he said after a while. "I am talking too much about horses. You must think me boring." "Not at all," Grace assured him. "I think it is wonderful that you have found work that you truly care about. Too many people simply do what is expected rather than what they love." "Is that why you came to Texas? To do what you love rather than what is expected?" Grace considered the question carefully. "Partially. My father expected me to marry a man from our congregation and settle into a traditional life in Boston. There was nothing wrong with any of the men who expressed interest, but I felt like I was disappearing into what everyone else wanted from me. I wanted to prove I could build something of my own. And teaching is what you have always wanted." "Since I was 12 years old and had a teacher who changed my life. She made learning feel like magic, and she treated every student with respect and kindness, no matter their background. I want to do that for children here." Cade nodded slowly. "This town needs someone like you. We have plenty of people who can teach reading and arithmetic, but not many who understand that children need more than that. They need someone who sees them as individuals." They talked until Mrs. Patterson cleared her throat meaningfully, indicating that the proper visiting time had expired. Cade rose reluctantly. "May I call on you again? Perhaps we could take a walk on Sunday afternoon after church services." "I would like that very much." Over the following weeks, Cade and Grace fell into a pattern of visits and walks, always properly chaperoned but increasingly comfortable with one another. Grace learned that Cade read voraciously, that he had taught himself basic veterinary care for his horses, and that he had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard and made her laugh. Cade discovered that Grace played the piano beautifully, that she had a gift for storytelling, and that beneath her proper Boston manners beat the heart of someone who genuinely believed in justice and kindness. 6 weeks after their first meeting, Cade invited Grace to visit his ranch. Mrs. Patterson accompanied them, of course, riding in the buckboard beside Grace while Cade drove. The property was even more impressive than Grace had imagined. The ranch house was solid and well-maintained, built from local stone with a wide porch that offered views of the surrounding grasslands. Corrals and outbuildings dotted the property, all showing signs of excellent care and management. Cade's father, Kade Zimmerman, met them at the house. He was in his early 60s, weathered by years of hard work but still strong and alert. His eyes were the same blue as his son's, and they assessed Grace with frank interest. "So you are the teacher my son cannot stop talking about," Henry said after Cade made the introductions. "Father," Cade said with a warning note in his voice, though his lips twitched with amusement. "What?" "I am simply stating facts." Henry turned to Grace. "I have not seen my son this animated about anything except horses in years. It is good to know a pretty woman can turn his head." "I hope I offer more than just a pretty face," Grace said with a smile. Henry laughed, a deep booming sound. "Oh, I like her. She has spine. About time you found someone who does not just simper and agree with everything you say." Mrs. Patterson supervised as Cade showed Grace around the property. They walked through the barns, where Grace admired the sleek horses and listened to Kade explain his breeding theories. She met the ranch hands, hard-working men who clearly respected their employer. She saw the foal that had been born the day after she and Kade met, now gangly and curious, following its mother around the paddock. "This is wonderful, Kade," Grace said as they stood by the fence watching the horses graze. "You have built something really special here." "My father built the foundation. I am just trying to honor his vision while adding my own ideas." He paused, then turned to face her fully. "Grace, I know we have only known each other for a short time, but I feel like I have been waiting for you my whole life. That first day when I saw you defending that boy, something just clicked into place inside me. You are brave and kind and smart, and you make me want to be a better man." Grace's breath caught. The August sun beat down on them, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang, but all she could focus on was Kade's earnest blue eyes. "I feel the same way," she admitted softly. "I came to Texas thinking I needed to build a life entirely on my own, but I am realizing that sharing a life with the right person is not the same as losing yourself. It is finding something bigger than what you could create alone." Kade reached out slowly, giving her time to pull back if she wanted, and took her hand. Even through her glove, Grace could feel the warmth and strength of his touch. "Will you let me court you properly? With the intention of marriage if we continue to suit each other as well as I believe we will." "Yes," Grace said, her heart soaring. "Yes, I will." Mrs. Patterson called to them from the porch, indicating it was time for the refreshments Henry had prepared, but Grace felt like she was floating as they walked back to the house hand in hand. The fall term began, and Grace threw herself into teaching with the passion Kade had recognized in her from the start. Her classroom held children ranging from 6 to 14, from various backgrounds and skill levels. She worked tirelessly to meet each child where they were, creating lessons that challenged without overwhelming, and always maintaining the atmosphere of respect and encouragement she had promised herself. Kade continued to court her steadily. He attended the church socials where she played piano, brought her small gifts of books he thought she would enjoy, and never missed their Sunday afternoon walks. The town watched their courtship with interest and approval. Grace Robinson and Kade Zimmerman simply made sense together, people said. They balanced each other, her refinement and his steady strength creating something solid and true. In October, the boy Grace had defended, whose name was Timothy Larson, showed up at school for the first time. His mother's health had improved enough that she felt comfortable sending him. Grace welcomed him warmly and was pleased to discover he was bright and eager to learn despite his limited previous education. She stayed after school to help him catch up, and Kade often arrived to walk her home during those extended hours. One afternoon in late October, as Grace was helping Timothy with his reading, 3 men pushed through the schoolhouse door. Grace's blood ran cold when she recognized them as the same men from the alley months earlier. They had clearly been drinking again, and the tall one's face was twisted with old resentment. Well, he said. "The fancy teacher lady. You cost us our jobs back in the summer, you know. Word got around about what happened, and the ranch let us go for being drunk on the job." Timothy pressed closer to Grace's side, trembling. She stood slowly, placing herself between the boy and the men just as she had before. "That is unfortunate for you, but your own actions cost you those jobs, not mine. I suggest you leave now. People know we are here, and they will come looking if we do not appear soon. Not before we teach you a lesson about minding your own business," the stocky one said. Grace's hand moved toward her desk drawer where she kept her derringer, but the tall man was faster than his drunken state suggested. He lunged forward and grabbed her wrist. Timothy screamed. The door burst open with a crash. Kade stood in the doorway, his face a mask of cold fury. "Get your hands off her." The man released Grace and stumbled back. Kade moved into the room with the controlled grace of a predator, positioning himself between Grace and the three men. "I am going to give you one chance to walk out of here peacefully. If you make me remove you by force, you will regret it." "There are three of us and one of you," the tall one said, but his bravado sounded hollow. "I am aware. I am also aware that I spent 2 years as a deputy marshal, and I know 17 different ways to put you on the ground without breaking a sweat. Your move." The men exchanged glances, and whatever they saw in Kade's face convinced them. They shuffled toward the door, the tall one pausing to spit. "This is not over." "Yes, it is," Kade said quietly. "Because tomorrow morning I am going to speak to Sheriff Rawlins about this incident, and if any of you ever come near Miss Robinson or this boy again, I will ensure you spend significant time in jail. Have I made myself clear?" They left without another word. As soon as they were gone, Grace's legs went weak and she sat down hard in her chair. Timothy burst into tears, and she pulled him into a comforting embrace while Kade knelt beside them both. "Are you hurt? Did he harm you?" Kade examined Grace's wrist carefully, his touch gentle despite the tension still thrumming through him. "I am fine, just frightened. How did you know to come?" "I was on my way to walk you home as usual. I saw them go in and recognized them from before." His jaw tightened. "I should have dealt with them more permanently back in August." "You dealt with them exactly as you should have. Violence should be a last resort, not a first choice." Grace stroked Timothy's hair as the boy's sobs quieted. "It is all right, sweetheart. You are safe now." "I will take you both home," Kade said. "Timothy, where do you live?" "I will make sure you get there safely." They locked up the schoolhouse and Kade drove them in his buckboard, first to Timothy's small home beyond the old mission, where his mother thanked them profusely, and then to Mrs. Patterson's boarding house. The widow took one look at Grace's pale face and ushered her inside with clucking concern. Kade caught Grace's hand before she went in. "I cannot keep doing this. I cannot keep walking away from you, not knowing if you will be safe." "I am fine, Kade, truly." "You are fine right now, but what about tomorrow? What about all the days I am not there?" He took a deep breath. "Marry me, Grace. I know we plan to court longer to be more proper about this, but I love you and I want you in my life permanently. I want to wake up every morning knowing you are safe beside me. I want to build a life with you to support your teaching and raise children together and grow old on the ranch. Say yes. Please say yes." Grace looked into his earnest blue eyes, at the face she had come to love so dearly over the past 4 months, and felt absolute certainty settle over her like a warm blanket. "Yes, Kade. Yes, I will marry you." He pulled her into his arms, propriety forgotten in the moment, and kissed her for the first time. It was gentle and fierce all at once, a promise and a celebration. When they finally drew apart, Mrs. Patterson was watching from the window with a satisfied smile. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in Tascosa. Grace wore a simple but elegant dress that Mrs. Patterson and 2 other women from town had helped her sew. Kade wore his best suit, and his father stood beside him as his best man. Timothy Larson sat in the front row with his mother, beaming. The entire town seemed to have turned out to witness the union of their schoolteacher and one of their most respected horsemen. Grace had written to her father, explaining her decision and inviting him to the wedding, but the distance and his health made the journey impossible. His return letter had been full of concern and blessing in equal measure. He worried she was rushing into marriage with a man she barely knew, but he also acknowledged that she had always possessed good judgment and that he trusted her to know her own heart. His final line made Grace cry. "Your mother would have been proud of the woman you have become." The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife and Kade kissed her, Grace felt like her life was truly beginning. The reception was held at the hotel, with food contributed by various townspeople and music provided by a ranch hand who played the fiddle with surprising skill. Grace danced with Kade, with Henry, with the sheriff, and even with young Timothy, who blushed furiously the entire time. As the sun set and the party began to wind down, Kade helped Grace into his bugboard for the ride to the ranch that was now her home. Henry had stayed in town for the night, giving them privacy in the house. Grace felt nervous excitement flutter in her stomach as they drove through the darkening landscape. "Are you happy?" Kade asked softly, his hand finding hers. "Happier than I ever imagined I could be," Grace answered honestly. "Are you?" "Grace, from the moment I saw you step between Timothy and those men, I knew my life had changed. You are everything I hoped to find and things I did not even know to hope for. I promise I will spend every day trying to be worthy of you. You already are worthy. You have shown me what it means to be truly seen and valued. I love you, Kade. I love you too." Their first months of marriage were a period of adjustment and joy. Grace continued teaching, rising early to prepare lessons and sometimes staying late to help struggling students. Kade managed the ranch with his father's decreasing involvement as Henry's arthritis worsened. They fell into comfortable rhythms, learning each other's habits and preferences, building the foundation of their life together. Grace discovered that Kade was an early riser who preferred to work with the horses in the cool morning hours. She learned he had a terrible singing voice but hummed constantly while working. She found out he was ticklish just behind his left knee, and that he always placed his boots in exactly the same spot every night. Kade learned that Grace was not a morning person despite her teaching schedule, and that the first 10 minutes after she woke were best spent in quiet companionship rather than conversation. He discovered she read every night before sleep, no matter how tired, and that she had a fierce competitive streak when playing cards. He realized she counted on her fingers when doing mathematics, a habit she tried to hide, and that she cried easily at sad stories, but maintained perfect composure in true crises. Winter arrived, bringing cold winds and occasional snow to the Texas Panhandle. The school closed for 2 weeks during the worst of it, and Grace spent those days helping around the ranch, learning skills she had never needed in Boston. She helped Henry in the kitchen, learning to cook hearty meals for working men. She tried her hand at mending tack and found she had a knack for it. She even assisted Kade with some of the gentler horses, though she freely admitted she would never have his natural horsemanship. Christmas was a quiet celebration, just the 3 of them in the ranch house. Grace made her mother's recipe for plum pudding, and Kade gave her a beautiful leather-bound journal for recording her thoughts and stories. She gave him a pocket watch with their wedding date engraved inside the cover. Henry presented them both with a painting he had commissioned from an itinerant artist months earlier, showing their wedding day in February. Grace began feeling unwell in the mornings. Mrs. Patterson, visiting for tea one afternoon, took one look at her and smiled knowingly. "You are expecting, dear." Grace blinked in surprise, then placed a hand on her still flat stomach with wonder. "I think you might be right," she told Kade that evening after supper, watching his face carefully for his reaction. He went very still for a moment, then a smile spread across his features that was brighter than the sun. "A baby. We are going to have a baby. In late summer, I think. September or October." He swept her into his arms, spinning her around until she laughed and insisted he put her down before they both fell over. "I am going to be a father," he said wonderingly. "Grace, you have made me the happiest man alive." "I think we made each other the happiest people alive," she corrected gently. Henry was equally delighted at the prospect of becoming a grandfather. He immediately began planning modifications to the house to accommodate a nursery, and insisted on taking over some of Grace's heavier chores. Grace continued teaching through the spring term, though she informed the school board she would need to take the fall term off for the baby's arrival. The town was happy for them. Students brought small gifts of baby clothes their own mothers had knitted. Mrs. Patterson organized a quilting bee to make blankets. Even Timothy, now reading at grade level thanks to Grace's patient tutoring, saved his pennies to buy a small carved wooden horse from the general store. Summer arrived hot and relentless. Grace's belly swelled, and she spent the dog days of August moving slowly, fanning herself on the porch and sipping cool water. Kade became almost comically protective, hovering over her constantly until she finally shooed him away to do his work. On a September evening when the heat was finally breaking into something more bearable, Grace's labor began. Kade rode to fetch Mrs. Patterson and the doctor while Henry stayed with Grace, his weathered hand holding hers and his calm presence helping to steady her nerves. The labor was long and difficult. Grace had never experienced such pain, waves of it that left her gasping and crying out. Kade was allowed in the room between contractions, his face pale with worry as he wiped her forehead with cool cloths and whispered encouragements. Mrs. Patterson proved to be an excellent midwife, having helped birth countless babies during her years in Tascosa. Finally, in the deep hours just before dawn, a baby's cry pierced the air. Grace collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted beyond measure but desperate to see her child. "A boy," the doctor announced, carefully cleaning the infant. "A healthy, strong boy." Kade stood frozen for a moment, tears streaming down his face before he moved to Grace's side. The doctor placed their son in her arms, and Grace looked down at the tiny red face, the wisps of dark hair, the minute fingers already curling into fists, and felt her heart expand in a way she had not known was possible. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We have been waiting for you." "He is perfect," Kade breathed, touching the baby's hand with one gentle finger. "Grace, he is absolutely perfect." They named him James Henry Zimmerman after Grace's father and Kade's. Little James proved to be a healthy baby with a good appetite and a surprisingly calm temperament. Henry was utterly smitten with his grandson, spending hours rocking him and singing old cowboy ballads in his rumbling voice. Grace had planned to return to teaching after a few months, but when the time came, she found herself reluctant to leave James for long hours. She discussed it with Kade one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset while James slept in her arms. "I thought I would want to go back right away," she said. "Teaching has always been so important to me, but now I find myself torn. I miss my students, but I cannot bear the thought of missing James's first smile or his first word." "Then do not go back yet," Kade said simply. "We can manage financially, and the school will find another teacher. You can return when James is older if you want, or you can find other ways to teach. You could tutor children here at the ranch, perhaps, or write teaching materials for other educators." Grace looked at her husband with love and gratitude. "You always make things seem so simple." "That is because they are simple. You do not have to choose between being a mother and being yourself. You just have to find the balance that works for our family." In the end, Grace arranged to tutor several students twice a week at the ranch, children who needed extra help or whose families lived too far from town for daily school attendance. It gave her the intellectual stimulation and sense of purpose she craved while allowing her to remain primarily focused on James. The years flowed past like a river, each season bringing its own joys and challenges. James grew into a sturdy boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's quick mind. He learned to ride almost before he could walk properly, following Kade around the corrals on a gentle pony. Grace officially retired from formal teaching, but became known throughout the area for her tutoring skills, helping numerous children prepare for higher education. When James was 3, Grace gave birth to a daughter they named Margaret Rose, after Kade's mother, and no particular Rose, but because Grace had always loved the name. Margaret inherited Grace's auburn hair and her father's love of horses. She was a whirlwind of energy from the moment she could crawl, constantly getting into things and making her parents laugh with her antics. Henry's health declined gradually over the years. His arthritis worsened until he could no longer help with the ranch work, but he remained sharp mentally and a beloved presence in his grandchildren's lives. He passed away peacefully in his sleep when James was 7 and Margaret was 4, surrounded by the family he adored. They buried him on a hillside overlooking the ranch, beside the grave of Kade's mother. Grace held Kade as he wept, understanding that even when death comes gently, the loss of a parent cuts deep. James stood solemnly beside his father, trying to be brave, while Margaret clung to Grace's skirts, not fully understanding but sensing the sadness around her. Life continued as it always does. The ranch prospered under Kade's management, his reputation for breeding quality horses spreading throughout Texas and beyond. Grace's tutoring expanded to include correspondence courses for students in remote areas, her teaching materials passing through mail routes across the state. James showed signs of following in his father's footsteps, displaying a natural talent with horses and a steady, responsible temperament. Margaret proved to be academically gifted, reading far above her age level and constantly asking questions about everything. When James was 12 and Margaret 9, Timothy Larson reappeared in their lives. Now a young man of 22, he had worked his way through school with Grace's early help and was returning to Tascosa as the new schoolteacher. Grace welcomed him warmly, pleased beyond measure at how the frightened boy she had defended had grown into a confident, educated man. "I would not be here without you, Mrs. Zimmerman," Timothy said during his first visit to the ranch. "You saw something in me when nobody else did. You gave me the tools to build a different life. I simply gave you the opportunity, Timothy. You did the hard work yourself. I hope I can be half the teacher you were. I am terrified I will not measure up," Grace smiled. "The fact that you care so much means you will do wonderfully. Love your students, respect them as individuals, and never stop believing they can succeed. That is the secret." Margaret begged to be enrolled in Timothy's school, and Grace and Kade agreed. James, who had been learning primarily through hands-on work with the ranch and tutoring from his mother, was less enthusiastic but agreed to attend for the formal arithmetic and history instruction. Watching her children head off to school each morning, Grace felt a deep satisfaction. The legacy of that moment 13 years ago, when she had stepped between a frightened boy and his tormentors, continued to ripple outward in ways she could never have predicted. More years passed. James grew into a young man much like his father, tall and steady, and completely at home with horses. At 19, he began seriously courting Sarah Miller, the daughter of a neighboring rancher, and Grace delighted in watching her son navigate the same tentative steps she and Kade had taken so many years before. Margaret, at 16, announced her intention to become a doctor. Women doctors were still rare, but Margaret had never let conventional limitations stop her. She was already corresponding with a women's medical college in the East, and Grace and Kade were determined to support her ambitions, even if it meant having her far away during her training. On a warm evening in May of 1899, Grace and Kade sat on the porch as they had countless times before. James was having supper with Sarah's family, and Margaret was at a friend's house studying for her final examinations. For once, they had the evening to themselves. "Can you believe it has been almost 16 years since we married?" Grace said, leaning against Kade's shoulder. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday. Other times I cannot remember life before you." He wrapped an arm around her waist. "Do you regret leaving Boston? Giving up the life you might have had there?" Grace considered the question seriously. "No, not for a moment. I have taught more children here than I ever would have in Boston. I have had freedom to experiment with teaching methods that no formal school board would have permitted. I have raised 2 incredible children with a man I love more with each passing year. This life, this messy, unpredictable, wonderful life, is exactly what I needed. Even the scary parts, the moments when those men threatened you, even those, they taught me that I am stronger than I thought. And they brought you into my life at exactly the right moment." She turned to look at him. "Do you remember what you said that first day? You said I had the heart you had been seeking." "I remember every word. I meant it then, and I mean it now. You have the bravest, kindest heart I have ever known. I think you saw qualities in me that I had not fully recognized in myself. You gave me the confidence to be completely who I am." Grace kissed him softly. "That has been your gift to me, Kade. You have never once asked me to be smaller or quieter or more conventional. You have celebrated every part of me. Because every part of you is worth celebrating." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The horses moved peacefully in the corrals. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. The land stretched out around them, the same land where Kade's parents had built their dream, where he had carried on their legacy, where he and Grace had raised their children and built a life rich in love and purpose. James married Sarah the following spring in a ceremony that drew friends and family from across the region. They settled on the Miller Ranch, which would eventually be his to manage when Sarah's aging parents retired. Grace cried happy tears as she watched her son pledge his life to a woman who clearly adored him, seeing echoes of her own wedding day in his nervous but determined face. Margaret left for medical college in the fall, amid much tearful hugging and last-minute advice. She promised to write every week, and she kept that promise faithfully. Her letters were full of fascinating details about her studies, the challenges of being one of only 7 women in her program, and her absolute determination to succeed. Grace kept every letter in a special box, taking them out sometimes to reread and feel connected to her adventurous daughter. With the children grown and pursuing their own paths, Grace and Kade entered a new phase of their life together. The ranch still demanded attention, but they hired additional help to manage the day-to-day work. Grace expanded her correspondence teaching, developing a comprehensive curriculum that was used by families across the West. Kade experimented with new breeding lines, working to create horses with even better temperaments and endurance. They traveled occasionally, visiting Margaret in Philadelphia and exploring parts of the country neither had seen. But they always returned to the ranch with relief, recognizing it as the heart of their shared life. In 1903, James and Sarah presented them with their first grandchild, a daughter named Grace. Holding the tiny girl and seeing her own name carried forward, Grace was overwhelmed with emotion. The circle of life continuing, the love expanding to encompass new generations, felt like the most profound blessing. Margaret graduated from medical college in 1904, one of 3 women in her class to complete the rigorous program. She returned to Texas and established a practice in Amarillo, a growing city about 40 miles from Tascosa. She specialized in treating women and children, often riding long distances to reach patients who could not come to her office. Grace recognized the same fierce determination to help the vulnerable that had driven her own life choices, and she was profoundly proud. Timothy Larson married one of his fellow teachers and had 3 children of his own, all of whom received excellent educations and went on to successful careers. He remained in touch with Grace throughout his life, never forgetting the woman who had defended him and changed his trajectory. The town of Tascosa itself underwent changes. The railroad bypassed it in favor of other routes, and the population declined as people moved to towns with better access to transportation. But a core community remained, and the Zimmerman Ranch continued to thrive. Kade adapted to changing times, adding cattle to their horse operation and investing in modern equipment when it made sense. Grace watched the new century unfold with interest and some trepidation. The world was changing rapidly, with inventions and innovations that would have seemed like magic when she first arrived in Texas. Automobiles began appearing on the streets. Telephones connected distant places. The old Wild West was transforming into something more settled and civilized. Through all the changes, her relationship with Kade remained the steady center. They still sat on the porch most evenings, talking about their day and their dreams. They still held hands like newlyweds. They still laughed at each other's jokes and supported each other through difficulties. The passion of their early days had mellowed into something even deeper, a bone-deep knowledge of and appreciation for each other that required no words. On their 25th wedding anniversary in 1908, their family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. James and Sarah brought their 3 children, including the oldest Grace, now 5 and full of questions about everything. Margaret came from Amarillo with her new husband, a fellow doctor she had met during her residency. Timothy traveled from his new teaching position in Amarillo with his family. The house was full of laughter and love, children racing through rooms that had once seemed so spacious and now felt wonderfully crowded. After the formal dinner, Kade pulled Grace aside to the porch, seeking a moment of quiet amid the joyful chaos. He presented her with a small box containing a delicate gold necklace with a heart-shaped pendant. 25 years ago, I told you that you had the heart I had been seeking, he said softly. Every year since has only proven how right I was. You are my partner, my love, my best friend. Thank you for building this life with me. Grace fastened the necklace around her neck, feeling the weight of the pendant rest just above her heart. Thank you for seeing me, truly seeing me from that very first moment. Thank you for encouraging me to be fully myself. Thank you for these 25 years, and for however many more we are blessed with. They kissed as the sunset painted the sky behind them, and through the window they could hear their family's laughter, see their grandchildren playing, witness the legacy of love they had created. The years continued to flow. More grandchildren arrived, 6 in total by 1915. Grace and Kade slowed down physically as they entered their 60s, but their minds remained sharp, and their love continued to deepen. They handed over most of the ranch management to hired help and to James, who officially took over operations in 1916. Margaret's medical practice flourished, and she became known throughout the region for her skill and compassion. She was especially beloved for her willingness to treat patients regardless of their ability to pay, often accepting payment in goods or services. In this, Grace saw her own values reflected and multiplied, the commitment to helping those in need passed down and adapted for a new generation. In 1918, the influenza pandemic swept across the world. Margaret worked herself to exhaustion treating patients, and Grace feared daily for her daughter's safety. The ranch remained relatively isolated and largely escaped the worst of the illness, but many people they knew in town fell sick. Margaret herself caught the flu but survived, though it left her weakened for months afterward. The pandemic reminded them of life's fragility and the importance of treasuring each moment. Grace and Kade had always understood this on some level, but the stark reality of so much loss reinforced it. They gathered their family whenever possible, creating memories through photographs and stories, ensuring that their grandchildren understood their history and their values. On a crisp autumn afternoon in 1920, Grace and Kade rode out together across the ranch land. At 60 years old, they were still capable riders, though they chose gentle horses and took their time. They stopped at the hillside where Kade's parents were buried, a spot that offered sweeping views of the property. "I want to be buried here too when the time comes," Grace said quietly. "Right beside you, looking out over everything we built." "That is still a long way off," Kade said, but his hand found hers. "Perhaps, but I like knowing the plan. I like the idea of resting here in this place that has been our life's work and our greatest joy." They sat for a while in companionable silence, watching the horses graze and the clouds drift across the endless Texas sky. "You remember that little boy, Timothy," Grace said eventually. "The one I defended what feels like a lifetime ago, of course. That is how we met." "I have been thinking about that day lately. How one moment, one decision to step forward rather than walk past, changed everything. If I had not helped him, we might never have spoken. Our children would not exist. Margaret would not be saving lives. James would not be running this ranch. All those grandchildren, all that love and life, it all spiraled out from one moment of choosing courage over convenience." Kade squeezed her hand. "That is who you are, Grace. You have never been able to walk past someone who needs help. It is what I loved about you first, and it is what I have loved about you every day since. We have been so lucky, Kade, so incredibly blessed. We have made our luck, I think, through hard work and choosing love and refusing to accept limitations." They rode back to the house as the sun began its descent. Two people who had spent nearly 40 years building a life together and who would gladly choose each other again in any lifetime. The 1920s brought continued change. The ranch incorporated more modern methods and equipment. James proved to be as skilled a manager as his father, while also being more willing to embrace new technologies. The telephone finally reached their area, connecting them more easily with Margaret and with the world beyond their immediate region. Grace published a book in 1925, a collection of her teaching philosophies and methods that found an audience among educators across the country. She was invited to speak at various conferences, and though she found public speaking intimidating, she accepted several invitations because she believed in the importance of sharing knowledge that could help children learn better. Kade's hair turned fully gray, then white, but his eyes remained the same piercing blue. Grace's auburn hair threaded with silver, and her face showed lines earned through years of laughter and love. They moved more slowly, tired more easily, but the essential core of who they were remained unchanged. They celebrated their 40th anniversary in 1923 with another family gathering, even larger than the previous ones. 13 grandchildren now, ranging from infant to young adult. James's oldest daughter, Grace, named after her grandmother, was 18 and engaged to be married. The cycle continued. In 1926, as they approached their mid-60s, both began to experience health issues. Kade developed heart problems that left him short of breath with exertion. Grace's joints ached with arthritis, making it difficult to write for long periods. They adapted, as they had always adapted, finding new ways to remain engaged with life despite physical limitations. Margaret insisted they come to Amarillo for regular checkups, fussing over them with professional concern tempered by filial affection. "You need to take better care of yourselves," she scolded after one examination. "We are old, Margaret. That is what happens," Grace said with amusement. "You are not old. You are experienced. There is a difference." But they were old, and they both knew it. Old in the way that meant waking up with new aches, forgetting names they had known for years, tiring halfway through tasks that once would have been simple. Old in the way that meant understanding their time was growing shorter. What they were not was done with love. If anything, the love between them had grown more precious, more consciously treasured. They held hands constantly. They said, "I love you," multiple times daily, never taking for granted that there would be another opportunity. They kissed goodnight with the tenderness of people who understood the gift of each day together. In the spring of 1928, Kade suffered a serious heart episode that left him bedridden for 2 weeks. Grace rarely left his side, reading to him, talking to him, simply being present. Margaret came and stayed at the ranch to provide medical care. James managed the ranch and his own family while desperately worried about his father. Kade recovered enough to get back on his feet, but he was noticeably weakened. He could no longer ride, which devastated him. The horses had been such a central part of his identity for so long. Grace understood his grief and did what she could to comfort him. "You gave them 66 years of your life," she told him one evening. "You bred some of the finest horses in Texas. You passed that knowledge and skill to James. Your legacy is secure, my love. It is all right to rest now. I just feel like I should be doing more, contributing more. Kade Zimmerman, you have contributed more to this family and this community than you will ever know. Now is the time to let others care for you as you have cared for so many." Summer arrived hot and relentless. On a July evening with thunderstorms rumbling in the distance, Grace and Kade sat on the porch in their rocking chairs. They had done this thousands of times over the decades, but tonight felt different somehow, weighted with significance. "Thank you," Kade said quietly. "For what?" "For everything. For seeing that boy needed help and stepping in, for letting me court you, for marrying me and building this life, for our children and grandchildren, for every day of the past 45 years. I would not change a single moment." Grace felt tears prick her eyes. "Neither would I." "You have been the great love of my life, Kade, my partner in every way that matters. Promise me something, anything. If I go first, do not shut yourself away. Keep teaching, keep writing, keep engaging with life. Our grandchildren need you. The world needs your wisdom." "Kade, do not talk like that. You are going to be fine." "We both know that is not necessarily true. I just need to know you will be all right." Grace reached across the space between their rocking chairs and took his hand. "I promise I will carry on, but you have to promise me the same. If I go first, you keep living fully until it is your time. I promise." They sat holding hands as the storm moved closer, lightning illuminating the darkening sky. Inside, they could hear their great-granddaughter laughing at something James was saying. Life continued all around them, the legacy they had built together. Kade passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 weeks later, Grace beside him as she had been every night of their marriage. He was 67 years old and had lived a life rich with purpose and love. The funeral drew people from across the state, all coming to pay respects to a man who had been unfailingly honest, hardworking, and kind. They buried him on the hillside beside his parents, just as he had always wanted. Grace stood with Margaret's arm around her shoulders and James supporting her other side, surrounded by grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and felt the enormity of her loss settle over her like a heavy blanket. But she had made a promise, and Grace had never been one to break her word. She grieved, deeply and honestly, but she also continued living. She still tutored children, though less frequently. She still wrote, though her output slowed. She spent precious time with her grandchildren, telling them stories about their grandfather and the early days of the ranch. Margaret tried to convince her to move to Amarillo, to live closer to medical care and family, but Grace refused. "This ranch is where I built my life with Kade. This is where I belong. I will leave when it is my time to join him, and not before." She lived alone in the ranch house with occasional visits from family, and hired help who came daily to assist with tasks she could no longer manage. She spent hours on the porch in her rocking chair, the one beside her forever empty, but somehow still companionable. She would talk to Kade sometimes, telling him about her day, about the grandchildren's accomplishments, about the small joys and sorrows of daily life. Years passed. Grace grew more frail physically, but her mind remained remarkably sharp. She celebrated her 70th birthday in 1933, surrounded by an even larger family. 19 great-grandchildren now, with more on the way. The Zimmerman legacy spreading like ripples across water. She still wore the heart necklace Kade had given her on their 25th anniversary. She touched it often, feeling connected to him through the simple gold pendant. At night, alone in the bed they had shared for so many years, she would hold his pillow and remember the sound of his breathing, the warmth of his presence, the absolute rightness of their life together. On a cool spring morning in 1936, Grace woke feeling different somehow. Lighter. She rose and dressed carefully, pinning up her white hair with the same precision she had always maintained. She made tea and sat on the porch watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. Margaret arrived for her weekly visit around mid-morning, bringing fresh bread and mail from town. She found her mother sitting peacefully in her rocking chair, the empty cup of tea beside her, a slight smile on her face. Grace had passed sometime in the past hour, quietly and gently, exactly as she would have wished. They buried Grace beside Kade on the hillside, finally reunited after 8 years apart. The entire family gathered, along with former students now grown with children of their own, colleagues from her teaching work, and friends from across the state. Timothy Larson, now 61 years old and long retired from teaching, spoke at the service about the day a brave young woman had defended a frightened boy and changed the course of his entire life. Grace Zimmerman believed that every person mattered, he said, his voice thick with emotion. She believed that standing up for what is right is never optional, even when it is difficult or dangerous. She taught me that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. She and Kade built a life based on those principles, and their legacy lives on in all of us who were touched by their kindness and strength. Margaret cleaned out her mother's room with tender care, preserving letters and photographs and small mementos that told the story of an extraordinary, ordinary life. She found her mother's journals, decades worth of thoughts and observations and memories. In the final entry, dated the night before Grace died, her mother had written, "I am ready now. I have lived fully and loved deeply. I have seen my children and grandchildren thrive. I have made my contribution to this world. Tomorrow I think I will see my Kade again, and we will sit together watching sunsets for eternity. What a blessed life this has been." The ranch continued under James's management, then passed to his children. Margaret practiced medicine until she was 70, then retired to write medical texts and mentor young doctors. The Zimmerman name became associated with integrity and quality throughout Texas. But more than business success or professional achievements, Grace and Kade's true legacy was the model they had provided of what love could be. Not the passionate whirlwind of youth alone, though they had experienced that. Not the comfortable companionship of old age alone, though they had had that too. But the full spectrum of commitment, choosing each other day after day, supporting each other's dreams, building something meaningful together. Their great-great-grandchildren would eventually hear the story of how they met, how a brave young teacher had defended a helpless child and caught the attention of a cowboy who had been seeking exactly such a heart. They would learn about courage and compassion, about building a life with purpose, about the kind of love that endures through decades and beyond death. In Tascosa, which eventually became more ghost town than thriving community, the old schoolhouse where Grace had taught still stood. The hillside where Grace and Kade rested together became a family landmark, visited each generation to pay respects and remember the couple who had started it all. And on quiet evenings when the Texas wind blew across the grasslands, when the sky turned orange and pink with sunset, if you sat very still and listened carefully, you might hear the echo of two voices, laughing together as they had for 45 wonderful years, their love story complete, but never truly ended. The heart Grace had possessed, the one Kade had recognized and treasured, lived on in the values they had instilled and the lives they had touched. In Margaret's compassionate medical care, in James's ethical ranch management, in Timothy's dedicated teaching, in the countless students who learned that education could open doors, in the grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried forward the family name with pride and purpose. That single moment of courage in an alley in 1883, when a 22-year-old woman chose to defend a helpless child, had rippled out across time and space, creating waves of goodness that would continue long after both she and Kade were gone. They had lived and loved and built something beautiful together, and in the end, that was everything that mattered. Their story was complete, every promise kept, every thread woven closed, every moment of their life together adding up to a masterpiece of love and commitment. They had found each other at exactly the right moment, recognized the rare treasure they possessed, and never once taken it for granted. And now they rested together forever on the hillside they had loved, their legacy alive in the world around them, their love story an inspiration for generations yet to come.